Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another Manitoba provincial election update. So we've had some interesting movement here in Manitoba. If you recall my last video on it, or if you are one of the newer viewers from this week, or last week I should say, you may not have seen that video yet. But in the last video, well, it wasn't looking so good for Stephenson. She was quite far behind, and if we pull up spreadsheets here, we can see, I'll just delete these. In seat-wise, in June 18th in the last video, she was down 9 seats. Now, there were some slight errors in this, and I think this July 30th one that was updated, it's basically the same polls are in the July 30th one, but I did some tweaking on my actual model background, and the Libs are winning a seat again. So I think this one's more accurate, but even still, that means they're down 8 seats, and it's likely the Liberals will probably vote the NDP more than the PCs will, not that it matters with an 8-seat majority. Well, 7 if you count the Liberals as a ally to the PCs. So things were not looking that good. And you look at PV terms, it's still not looking that great. We're looking at like a 4.3 lead for the NDP. Strong position in Winnipeg, decent in the rurals, wasn't looking so hot. Now, we've had 2 real polls-ish since the last update. Now, I say ish because I don't think there's a good gap between them. We had a probe poll, like the last video update, I should say. We had a probe poll released that happened actually before June 18th, but it was released afterwards, which had the race as a tie. And we've had a Main Street poll released last week, or this week of recording, but the week before this video goes live, that now has a 4-point lead. Now, you can quibble. I've seen some people quibbling about how Main Street's actually calculating the lead and their weights and stuff, but that doesn't really matter because I used headline numbers a little bit, but I mostly just used the regionals and the demographic data, so any quibblings with Main Street's methodology, if there's any errors with it, doesn't really matter because it doesn't really affect my model. So we now clearly see here with these 2 polls, one with a tie and one with a slight lead for the PCs, 4-point lead, now we're in a tie overall. Now, it could be that these are outliers and the next wave of polls could show it going back the other way, but I suspect not. And here's why. So if we bring over the list of polls from Wikipedia, there might be more polls than these, but these are the ones that I'm actually using right now because there is, as far as I'm aware, no paywalled polls or secret polls that are in effect here. And if we compare it to the first poll post Stephenson's leadership, the PCs are around 37, 36. And if you look at just 2023, we have 136, sure, but we have a 38, a 39, a 41, a 42. So it's clear. What did I just do? It's very clear that there is some upward trend for the PCs. And if we look at the NDP, they're 42, 42, and now they're 44, 44, 41, 40, 38. So it looks like they're probably relatively flat in actual vote support, but the PCs are going up a little bit. Maybe now the NDP are slightly declining, but it's not that clear. So what might be happening here? Usually we don't see a party, well, we do, but we don't often see parties recover in the middle of summer like this before an election comes out. So what could be happening here? Well, there's 2 big ones I suspect. So the first one is voter retention. I don't have new data on this. Main Street doesn't actually publish this data, though they absolutely do collect it, just not published. And neither does, actually, does Probe do it? Let me pull this up. Bear with me. Yeah, we only have 3. The most recent Probe did, but a lot of them don't. Or sorry, not the most recent Probe did, but the second last one did. So what I suspect is happening, but we don't have a lot of data to confirm this yet, is the PC's vote retention is rebounding. I don't think the NDP are losing voters right now. So prior to this, we had like 15-20% of the PC's 2019 voter base defecting from the party. That's how you go from about 47 to 40 if you do that math. I mean, it's more complicated than this, but if we're going to like wildly oversimplify, that's 85%, right? It's more complicated than just that because they're also gaining voters from other parties, but roughly about 15% of their voter base has defected. 15 to 20%, I should say, sorry. In previous polling, and that put them in this position. What I suspect is happening, because if you look down and you look in a lot of these polls, a lot of the defecting isn't firm. It's like 80% PC, then you have some NDP, some Libs, some Greens, some other, and then a lot of undecided. And what usually happens in these polls is they proportionally allocate the undecideds, which is perfectly reasonable usually, but in the case of something so predictive of your next vote as previous vote, to me it seems like a bad idea. In the sense that these voters are more likely to either not vote or vote for the PCs. So what I suspect is happening here is a lot of these undecided 2019 PC voters are seeing that the NDP has a chance to win and are scared of such a win for the NDP, so in turn are actually turning out to vote again. They've become decided out of fear. So what does this actually mean for this election? Well, it actually means that this is going to be a much more competitive election than I think anyone thought for the most of time here. In a lot of ways, I think this is mirroring where Alberta is, but slower because Stephenson herself isn't that interesting of a candidate. She's a very milquetoast generic premier. There's really not anything to complain about per se with her. Now, more conservative people might dislike that she's not very strongly conservative. She's very moderate. But in actual actions, she hasn't really done anything interesting, so there's really nothing for anyone to be bothered by, which is good and bad. There's also nothing for people to be inspired by or to want to re-elect her for, which is an issue of being milquetoast. You are boring. So I don't think it's really necessarily her rebounding it. I really do think it's just voters, because we're getting closer to October when the election is, are starting to pay attention again, starting to figure out what's going on, and are realize, oh shit, the NDP might win. And a lot of these PC voters and other center-right voters, or even centrist voters, are being like, oh, I don't want the NDP to win. I don't want this at all. Now, the interesting thing about this is right now we don't actually have definitive platforms because the election hasn't started yet. So we don't know what the Manitoba NDP are going to campaign on. So I really strongly suspect at this point the Manitoba NDP are not losing ground per se because of themselves. Once the election starts and we see their campaign, we see their platform, we can better analyze that. But right now, it appears they are likely losing ground because of Singh and the National Party. That's what I would put a lot of money on. Now, if you are from Manitoba, you might have seen or heard some news stories that I might have missed. I do try to keep up with it, but when you're covering a bunch of elections like I am, sometimes you miss things, especially when it's areas that are not directly affecting you because the local media doesn't report it at all. So I have to search it out myself to find stuff for Manitoba, and I could miss things. So comment below if you think there's anything important that has happened that might also explain this change. I could be wrong. That's perfectly valid. But I very strongly suspect it is the federal party hurting the provincial party here. Because we also saw that sort of happen in Alberta, though it wasn't the entire case in Alberta. The bigger gist of why Alberta swung back conservative from the 2021-2022 polls is Smith is more interesting than Kenney was, and Kenney had betrayed a lot of his base, and Smith brought them back. That's the gist of what happened there. Now, Notley probably was hit a lower ceiling than she could have because of the federal party, and probably made Smith's job easier. Now, conversely, here, I don't think so far Stephenson has done anything to rally voters. She's not done anything particularly interesting economically. She's not done anything particularly interesting socially. Her governance seems adequate. I have not heard or seen anything from Manitoba that is a particularly egregious, any particular bad corruption or weird gaffes or silly scandals. I've not seen any wild decisions such as some we might see from Ford when he tried to Section 33, the teachers support staff, no, the school support staff strike. I can't remember the union's name, but we all know what I'm talking about. We haven't seen anything big or controversial from Stephenson. So, that seems to really be the story here. We are in a moment where voters are realizing the NDP could win. What should we then expect going forward? August, September, into October. What's at play here? What's the story? What should we watch out for? And well, if you look at this and you look at rural Manitoba over here and some of these smaller towns, none of this is interesting. I think I called these backwards. Apologies. None of these are in play. Maybe Dauphin a little bit. Maybe Selkirk a little bit. Maybe Brandon East, because I've colored these backwards again. But the main thing to watch here, and what this entire election is going to be, very, very similar to Alberta's election, which is basically all about northern Calgary. This is all about south and maybe a little bit east Manitoba. Winnipeg. The outskirts of Winnipeg, maybe, if you will. There's a couple ridings here in the south here that are close that the PCs could easily win. Some in the east, one over here in the west. There's some ridings that the Liberals could easily win. And there's some ridings here that the PCs could easily, the NDP could easily win back. We are talking a situation where the NDP could reasonably and plausibly get back to 32 seats. And we're also looking at a situation where the NDP could easily and reasonably go down to 22. And it could be 32, 3, 22. These are both very plausible outcomes. We don't have enough data yet, and we don't know enough yet to really determine this. And in a sense, this might be a very underwhelming election because it's so few ridings are in play. We're actually kind of seeing this trend happen across Canada at large, even largely the West, where at least in countries with first past the post elections, as time progresses right now, in what you could probably say is the fourth turning, we are getting more and more divided politically, and there's less and less swing ridings. There was some recent things, there was a political report in the US recently, which had only I want to say 8 toss-up states for the presidential election in 2024, whereas 30 years ago there was 20. More and more jurisdictions are becoming incredibly safe, and fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer are moving. Now, this will not be like this forever. We are just in a particular moment in time during a major political realignment. That's why this is happening. The coalitions are changing, so there's only a small group of places that are transitory, because if we look at this broadly, and we look at this in the 80s, what was the political coalitions in the 80s? Before the realignment really would have started happening? Well, we had the right, in Manitoba case, the PCs. They were broadly economically conservative, economically right-wing. But they were socially moderate. Some socially conservatives, some socially liberals. And then on the left, you had, I think it was the NDP, but it might have been the Liberals at the time, I'm not 100% certain, for Manitoba. You had a broadly center-left party that also had socially conservative and socially liberal segments of it, but it was fiscally liberal. Right now, we are evolving into a different political alignment. I would wager what we are doing, what's happening, especially because of all the culture war stuff going about, is we are aligning more on social issues and less on economic. So you're going to be having a socially conservative party with fiscally left and right wings, and a socially liberal party with fiscally right and left wings. That's what it appears to be happening, at least for first past the post countries. But while we're in this transition period between, pardon me for hitting the mic there, but I'm doing hand gestures for no reason because you can't see them. While we're in this transition period between these two styles of politics, these two party alignments, we are going to get a situation where there's not many ridings that fit this cross-section that are actually happily swing ridings in this dichotomy. Because in this transition period, for a riding to be a swing riding, for it to be competitive, you need the riding to be effectively fiscally and economically conservative, but also fiscally and economically liberal. You need to have segments of it that are both. Traditionally, in the 80s political system, you had the rurals, which were economically conservative, socially conservative, and you had the suburbs, which were socially liberal and usually fiscally conservative. Then you had the inner cities, which were fiscally liberal and fiscally conservative, and then you had the outer cores, which were usually socially conservative and fiscally liberal. Now, these are broad overstrokes. So what this meant is you'd have all the city usually on one side, and you'd have all of the rurals and the suburbs on the other. And then you'd have occasional blips in the suburbs and the rurals that were union or mining towns, which would be economically liberal and would go for that party. That's how you see federally the NDP winning James Bay Timmins or Windsor-Tecumseh or Niagara. In Ontario eventually, Niagara. That's how you see those seats happening. Those are areas that are voting left-wing because of unionized politics, not necessarily cultural issues. They are fiscally liberal, but they're usually socially conservative, or at least culturally conservative. Same thing you see in some more outer core city ridings. They're more culturally conservative than you would expect, but they're generally fiscally liberal because they live in a city. Cities generally make people fiscally liberal. Now, these are some broad stroke generalizations, but this is generally the trends we're seeing. But as we see these coalitions shift, the inner cities are obviously not moving, and the rurals are obviously not moving. But what you're seeing, such as federally, you're seeing the union towns swing right wing because it's about cultural issues, not economic. And you're seeing the suburbs swing left wing. And we're really down to a couple of parts of the suburbs and a couple parts of outer core of cities that are competitive right now. Because the rural and the union towns are gone. And in the cities, the inner core and most of the suburbs are gone. So it's really a small cross-section of suburb and a small cross-section of outer core that are competitive. And to be clear, the difference between outer core and suburb is it's a very blurry line, but usually the outer core has more density than the suburbs, but less density than the inner city. If that makes sense. So you generally see more more families in the outer core than you do in the inner city. The inner cities tend to be either rich or young, whereas the outer core is more families. That's the general rule of thumb, but it's not as crystal clear as that. It's a very blurry line. There's no clear gap or distinction here. But that's what's happening. Or at least that's what seems to be happening. And you see an interesting result of this in places like Manitoba, where we only have maybe a dozen ridings in Winnipeg that are competitive. If that. What is it, like 10? I think I counted earlier. There's about 10 ridings in Winnipeg and maybe 3 in the rest of the province that are in play. And even the rest of the province I'm really skeptical about. So it's like 10. That's not a lot of ridings. There's 57 ridings and 47 are probably pretty safe calls. That's why we look back to June 2022 in my Ontario elections. I had a decent amount of mistakes there because I was doing some things wrong, which I've corrected since then. You learn by doing, basically. You can't actually be good at this unless you fail. I didn't fail in Ontario, by the way. I just didn't do as good as I'd like. But I managed to do a lot better than I should have in Ontario because there's really not many ridings in play. There's not that many. The actual interesting gist of what I'm doing here necessarily, actually in projection terms, like actual riding projections, is sussing out these small, tiny little ridings and getting them right. Am I good at this? We'll see. So it's kind of evolving. I think I was decent in Alberta, but I wasn't as good as I could have been. Overall popular vote trends, I'm doing quite well. So there's that. Pardon me, I've been coughing all the time. I'm trying to pause the video or recording while I'm coughing, but I have not been succeeding always. So where does that leave everything here? Well, we are in a very interesting situation here where I don't actually have a good intuition what this election is going to look like. Whereas if we look at Alberta, the last one I've covered, Smith was very clearly populist right, edging more to center-right socially, center-right economically, but flexible on economics. That's why she was willing to spend so much on the Calgary rink, for example. She touted the daycare plan as another example, though the daycare plan is terrible. That's her... Anyways. Notley is equally easy to categorize. She's mostly center-left socially, but is a bit center-left economically. But not too center-left economically. Very, very centrist economically. That election was very easy to categorize and understand, predict what was going to happen. That's why I was very confident saying in December, well, even from the beginning, that Smith was going to win. December really crystallized that Smith was going to win. This, I don't really know, because I don't know how Stephenson is going to campaign. I don't know what her platform is going to be. I don't know what her issues are going to be. I have no idea. She's such an anomaly because she doesn't really do anything interesting. I have no idea what she believes, and I have no idea what she wants to do. Other than just be in power, I guess. I have no idea. Now, Wab Kinew is a bit easier to categorize. He's a traditional NDPer, or a bit more moderate, possibly, but traditional NDPer. He's probably going to have a very normal NDP platform, the one you might see in Nova Scotia, the one you might see in Ontario or BC. Probably not BC, but you're probably going to see something similar to that. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe he will shift a little bit to try to contest the PCs more. Maybe. But I'm skeptical. I don't really think it's going to happen. I think he's going to probably run a generic platform. But since I don't know what Stephenson. They both have S's and they're both women, so it's really messing me up. What Stephenson is going to do, this makes this election hard to predict. If she runs a generic, even 2008 conservative campaign, she's probably going to lose. The reason why that's going to probably lose is I don't think it's going to work well in the suburbs. I could be wrong. But the election is the outer core in the suburbs, as you see here. Like, this is like the inner core here. So we're like, suburbs are like this. And these ones. And then we have the outer core, and it's like this. Something like that. Anyways, you kind of get the picture here. The competitive ridings are going through the cross-section between the suburb and the outer core. That's what's touching it. That's the competitive spots. I don't think a 2008 style conservative campaign would work. Voters care too much about social issues now to only have that work. Now, at the same token, it is very conceivable that she could make a non-socially focused one work. We did see Houston do that in Nova Scotia. We did see King kind of do that in PEI. Though you could argue his opponents were a bit more socially focused than he was. So, by virtue of not being socially liberal, he is socially conservative by default, even though he's not a socially conservative at all. That makes sense? Though I will caution that, because if we look at Houston didn't win the election because of really, for the most part, policy versus the policy of Ian Rankin. Houston won because it was basically a referendum on the Liberals' handling of healthcare. One of the biggest provincial portfolios, and everyone decided, the rural parts of the province decided that, the Liberals suck at healthcare. And they voted Houston in as a result. So that's a different election. I don't think that referendum kind of thing is going to happen here, and if it does, it's not going to help Stephenson. And if we look at other provinces that have had election recently, you look at Ontario, Ford isn't particularly interesting socially, but his opponents, Horwath and Del Duca, were more socially liberal. So by virtue of not being socially liberal, he is the socially conservative option. A very weak one and a milquetoast one, and I know many conservatives who are very unhappy with Doug Ford, but that definitely played in his favor there. Same thing, I would argue, happened in the last Saskatchewan election. The last New Brunswick election, though Blaine Higgs is a socially conservative by anyways, so it's easier. It's easier to win on that because of that. Anyways, you see this also in 2022 Quebec. Legault campaigned in a French sense as a social conservative because Francophone Quebecois social conservatism isn't the same as Anglophone. It's much more nationalistic and it's much more concerned about preserving French culture and heritage and less about things like abortion or whatever, euthanasia, stuff like that. It's less focused on that stuff, more focused on preserving French culture. And then we have a negative example of this, where you had the last BC election, you had Kevin Falcon running I would even argue, a slightly socially liberal campaign, and he flopped really hard against the NDP, who ran a also slightly socially liberal campaign, but a more economically moderate one. The NDP destroyed him. And it looks like you're going to see the 2024 BC election might be very similar. Unless the new guy, whatever his name is, I can't think of his name, decides to change this. So, swing back to Manitoba here. What does this mean? Well, we are seeing this trend in every other province, even federally, that you need to focus something on social issues. You don't have to be Bible-thumping social conservative to win, but you can't be ambiguous. Sorry, you can't be socially liberal. You can be ambiguous. That's the Doug Ford strategy. But the ambiguous strategy only really works if the other side goes hard on it, because then they create the polarization needed for you to win. So either Stephenson has to be slightly center-right. I don't mean hard right-wing, just slightly center-right on social issues overall. Or she has to hope that Wab Kinew, I don't think I'm pronouncing his name right. So can someone comment below? That's the pronunciation. I'm terrible at this. But anyways, unless Wab Kinew runs a hard left campaign, he does have a chance here. If he does run a hard left, he's probably going to lose. There's no way that's going to win. So it really depends on how much sway activists have in the NDP in Manitoba versus how much more pragmatic election winners have sway. But with that, I'll wrap up the video here. If you liked it, by all means, like, share, subscribe. I have lots of new subscribers, so if you want to watch or read some more opinionated tweets, you can follow me on Twitter at BagelPolling. But otherwise, I will bid you adieu, and I will see you next week with something different.